Clearly, the current government is nothing like the last few governments, not least because they haven't had time to do anything yet. But I do have that slight sense in the back of my head that I had a lot during COVID. And during COVID, I was horribly wrong. So were you. Do you remember we'd say, well, they must know what they're doing. They can't be making it up as they go along. They must be. There must be a reason why these people are getting the contract. They wouldn't be so blatant and so transparent as to just give contracts to their mates. Billions of pounds worth of contracts to their mates when the rest of the country approaches the crisis from the point of view of asking, what can I do to help? We were governed by people whose circle was absolutely populated by people who respond to a national crisis by saying, what can we do to make some money out of this? The inimitable Carol Vorderman is particularly powerful on this point. But the sense that there must be a plan dissipated pretty quickly, right? A secret plan that the likes of you and I, bears of very little brain, were unable to discern. We couldn't quite spot what the plan could be because it looked from where we were sitting that they'd made a terrible mistake, that they were doing something really stupid. I'm getting obsessed with lists at the moment. Have you noticed? Poor Eleanor, the producer of this programme, gets told to start making a list of things about every 20 minutes at the moment. Today I said, start making a list of the questions that we really like, the questions that sort of run through various conversations that we have, and you realise halfway through that in a way you're asking the same question that you were asking last week on a story that you thought was different. Like, how can you actually deal with a badly behaving child, for example? Popped up last week, and there's a story around today that in many ways leads us to the same, most effectively deal, most helpfully deal, leads us into the same territory. I kind of want to make a list of the things that we looked at the time and thought they are behaving like absolute imbeciles, politically speaking, if not morally. There must be something we can't see. It must be the case that there's something going on here that is more complicated than everything that is visible above the surface, right? And that is how I feel today about the winter fuel payments. Partly because of this story that Transparency International have unearthed about the sheer scale of corruption-adjacent PPE contracts that were doled out by Boris Johnson and his mates, doled out during that period. Because the figure is 15 billion, and the figure set to be raised by the cessation of winter fuel payments for millions of pensioners is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of that, isn't it? So the money's not enough. Hearing the head of Unite, was it Unite? It was the head of Unite, wasn't it? Sharon Graham this morning calling for a wealth tax. She's not the only one. The suggestion that people who have got in excess of £4 million could pay 1% on everything they own. And that's clear, everything that's clear. So you wouldn't pay 1% on a £3 million house if half of it was still in hock to the building society or the bank. So 1% on everything you are. And you know, you sort of imagine what it would be like to be in that category. And you presume that if you were in that category, you'd be fine doing that. I wouldn't have any problem at all doing that. But it turns out that most of the people who are in that category probably would have a problem with it, which means that if we were, we probably would too. But you'd raise billions by doing that, potentially. You'd raise this. I mean, if you clawed back all the money that had been robbed from the taxpayer during the doling out of these COVID contracts, if you actually resurrected the investigations that Rishi Sunak stopped into some of these contracts, you'd probably raise loads more money. Although them being clever and having fancy accountants, they'd be able to pay lawyers or something, or go bankrupt or whatever the arrangements would be. But the actual figure of how much will be raised by the winter fuel payment cessation is nowhere near enough at first glance to justify the political difficulties that it is already causing. And that's why I think there's something else going on here. There's no earthly way that Keir Starmer could have failed to understand that this would be Tinder. This would be, by that I mean firewood, not the dating app. This would be absolute jackpot territory for his enemies. The right-wing media, which is not a phrase we're going to stop using anytime soon, given that it still describes almost all of the print media in this country, an increasing an increasing proportion of the broadcast, they are going for him like a rat up the proverbial drainpipe, just as anybody would have been able to predict. You even open the door to that incredibly disingenuous comparison between old age pensioners and train drivers. Because remember, there's a certain type of Tory who hates nothing more than the idea of a working class citizen of this country earning 70 grand a year. How dare they? How very dare they? Rishi Sunak, £625 million in the bank, describing train drivers as well paid. What words would he use to describe himself? If a train driver is well paid, what is someone who's drawing down probably millions of pounds a year just by dint of owning shares? He could stay in bed all day and earn more than 100 train drivers in the course of the average year. But remember, train drivers are well paid, and the money that is going to stop rail strikes and to bring train drivers' pay back to parity with where it would have been before the Tories got in, that is money that should have stayed in the pockets of pensioners, including Richard Branson. All of them, all of the pensioners deserve this money. So she's looking to save, or they are looking to save, £1.4 billion a year. What's that phrase? There's a great figure of speech about numbers, isn't there? Some are too big. We can't get our head around the big numbers. So £1.4 billion a year, £15 billion worth of contracts. It's about a penny on the pound of income tax, and everybody goes absolutely bonkers. So here's what I think, right? There must be more going on here than the simple necessity of raising money, because the political capital that is being expended is much greater than the financial capital that is being accrued. Does that make sense? That's an equation, right? So how much is it going to cost us in terms of goodwill and politics? And then that number is nebulous, that number is speculative, but, you'll see all the front pages. Starmer to give winter fuel rebels short shrift. You'll see Rishi Sunak returning, no doubt, to the question of train drivers, bloody train drivers, tycoon train drivers, driving those trains around with all that money. And they don't even use coal anymore on steam trains. They actually just shovel their own wages into the boiler to keep the train. Those train drivers get so much money, and they will continue with this line of attack. Axing of winter fuel payments was a cruel planned betrayal, according to someone who the Daily Express considered worthy of a front page, and it will continue. And then on the left, you will have a rebellion. The Guardian reports today that scores of MPs could refuse to back Starmer over cut in fuel payments. So I don't think, and listen, all of this now is open to debate. You could explain to me why £1.4 billion is a much more significant sum of money than I currently contend or I currently believe. And you are welcome to challenge the idea that anything here is subtle or sophisticated or bubbling away below the surface. About 50 Labour MPs could refuse to back controversial plans. When you've got a majority of, 174, you could sustain some of the largest parliamentary rebellions in the history of Parliament and still romp home untroubled. So that's an interesting political dynamic that we thought we were entering into in 2019. But of course, electing a prime minister based upon complete lies was always going to end badly. That hasn't happened here. You've got an enormous majority that he is prepared to compromise. He's prepared to take a hit on a big rebellion. And he's painted a target on his back for really obvious, if sometimes a bit lazy, attacks, comparisons with train drivers or the demonisation of pensioners. And of course, crucially, he's upset people. He's possibly upset you if you're going to lose your winter fuel payment, whether you need it or not. The idea that your purse is the first place that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves should have visited upon their mission to restore the nation's finances or improve the nation's finances. The idea that your purse or your radiator was the first port of call would be, I imagine, potentially quite obnoxious. Why me? Why is he coming for my winter fuel payment? And the prize is £1.4 billion. So, and also, Jenny in Romford asks about, is the money saved worth a life? And what you need to do is Google how many pensioners die of the cold every year. It's a brutal reality, but it won't necessarily be because they couldn't afford to heat their homes. It will be because they were frightened of turning the heating on. And you need to be careful about that when you're conducting conversations like this. Nick had a call this morning from somebody saying, Keir Starmer should be prosecuted for murder if a single pensioner dies. Presumably completely ignorant of the fact, both of them, I presume, completely ignorant of the fact that the statistics for how many pensioners die of the cold every year are published every year. And no one was ever calling for Rishi Sunak to be prosecuted for murder when I think it was about 4,000 pensioners reportedly died of the cold, excess deaths caused by the cold. So, there are brutal calculations and brutal statistics here. But there's also politics, and we love politics. There's also politics. So on the credit side of this political decision, there is £1.4 billion. On the debit side, there is the painting of enormous and effective targets on their backs. There is the spurious but politically effective comparisons with the unions. Why are you giving money to workers? But they never say workers. They say, why are you giving money to the unions when you could be leaving it with pensioners? There is the opportunity for irresponsible journalists to claim that they don't care about old people. So much political capital in play that I would argue if you actually had an exchange rate whereby you could translate political capital into financial capital, where I am today at 10:15 on Monday morning, this looks to me like a really, really bad investment. The amount of political capital that they potentially squander, albeit at the beginning of a 5-year term, so there's plenty of room for it to come back, but the political capital they are squandering by doing this does not justify, to me, at the moment, until you start talking to me, the raising of a mere, and I use that word advisedly, a mere £1.4 billion. So why are they doing it? 0345 6060 973. If not just to raise money, if the reaction, the condemnation, the criticism, the castigation, if all of these things are actually factored in to the decision, then why are they doing it? It could be an epic miscalculation. There's plenty of room on the switchboard for you to make that case. They have made a terrible mistake. 0345 6060 973. Give me the whats, the whys, and possibly even the wherefores. But I doubt it personally because, for good or for ill, dull and detail driven describes both Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. At the moment, I still think for good. So detail-driven, very cautious, careful politicians have done something which expends enormous amounts of political capital, potentially, in pursuit of a relatively small amount of money. So why do you think they have done it?